In this lesson, we will learn about the cascade. The first letter in CSS stands for cascading. So let's spend a few minutes to understand what the word means in this context. A dictionary will tell us that a cascade is a small waterfall, typically one of several that fall in stages down a slope. So this is excellent. We can use the waterfall as a metaphor to understand the cascade that takes place in the web browser. Let's think of water in this example as stylistic instructions for the web browser. Now we know that by default, without CSS, web pages look very boring. They look very plain. All of the text is black, everything looks very uniform, and there's not much of a creative layout. However, even without any CSS, it's not as if our waterfall is completely void of water. There's still a little bit of styling going on. The first tiny bit of water that is layered onto the waterfall is known as browser defaults. So for example, by default, web browsers will render heading level 1 elements in a larger font size than standard paragraph text. So this default stylistic preference of the web browser is the first tiny stream of water that makes the waterfall. But then we, as web developers, can come in with our CSS. We can come in with our own style sheets and override that preference with a new layer of water or a new stream of water. So we can simply edit a CSS file in our text editor, target the heading level 1 element, and say, you know what, instead of being huge, your font size should only be a little bit larger than regular text, and you shouldn't be bold either. You should just use a standard or normal font weight. I think that looks much better. So that's the first component of understanding the cascade. It's this idea that the web browser has defaults and we can override those defaults. The next step in understanding how the cascade works is unraveling a concept known as inheritance. Inheritance is the way that certain CSS properties are passed along from ancestor elements to children elements. So if you think of the Russian stacking doll analogy, inheritance is what allows certain stylistic traits to be passed along to children. So for example, we know that in our HTML structure that the body element houses or contains all of the page's content. So let's imagine that we wanted our entire page to use green text. Instead of selecting individual elements, we can simply write CSS that selects the body element, and the color of green will be inherited by all children elements. So if I refresh, we can see the entire page uses green text. So if we think of the waterfall analogy, by default the web browser said all text should be black. Then our CSS came in and said, no, it should be green. Now, just as we overrode the browser default, we can override our own default, so to speak. So we said that all text should be green, and that cascaded down to all children elements, but it's very easy to override that preference if we get a bit more specific. So let's say that we want the footer text in our website to be orange. In our CSS file, we simply select the footer, color orange. So we can see how simple it is to create stylistic preferences that cascade to multiple elements on the page. And then when we need to scale back, we can simply override that preference for a particular area. Now I will point out that not every single CSS property can be inherited. So for example, color can be inherited. Now there's no sense in this moment memorizing which properties can be inherited and which cannot. You will learn that information throughout the remainder of this course as it becomes necessary. Now for the time being, there's one final topic that I want to cover in this lesson. So we've covered cascading, we've covered inheritance. Now I want to talk a little bit about specificity. Specificity is how the web browser decides which set of CSS instructions to listen to if two or more styles are competing with one another. So for example, let's imagine that instead of selecting body to make all the text green, let's imagine that we selected all of the paragraph elements on the page. So if I refresh, we can see that the heading level 1 is black by default, but our new rule is selecting only paragraphs. Now, if we wanted our footer text to be orange, footer color orange, this will not work. So if I refresh, you can see that nothing changes. This footer text is still green. So earlier we learned that overriding an inherited value is very simple, but overriding a value that has been explicitly set on an element is a bit trickier. So because this selector is actively targeting the paragraph elements on the page, we cannot rely on footer to trickle down the inheritance of orange to its children. Instead, we need to directly compete with and beat this rule. So instead of footer, we'll say footer space P. Now this rule, or this selector, is more specific than this selector. So this selector will win. So if I save and refresh, we can see that those two paragraphs are orange. Now this is an excellent example of specificity. So in this case, it's clear. Common sense tells us that this rule is more specific. However, specificity is a very complex topic, because it's not always so clear what the web browser will consider more specific. Now, instead of having a 30-minute lesson just on specificity, we will instead learn about it in chunks or in waves. So as your understanding of CSS as a whole continues to develop, so will your understanding of specificity. Now, for this first wave of specificity knowledge, all I want you to keep in mind are these few following rules of thumb. Number 1. Descendant selectors are more specific than type selectors. We already saw an example of this. Footer P is more specific than P because P selects all paragraphs on the entire page, whereas footer P only selects paragraphs within a certain section of the page. Number 2. Deeply nested descendant selectors are more specific than shallow or simple descendant selectors. So for example, if I wanted to override this rule, I could simply say body footer P. Now I'm not saying that this is considered a best practice or that this is an example of squeaky clean CSS, but this is more specific than this selector. So now we could say color red. We can see that that change is being obeyed. Number 3, class selectors are more specific than type or descendant selectors. So for example, if we wanted to override this rule, we can simply see that this paragraph has a class of highlight. So all we need to do is type period and then the name of the class, highlight, color purple, and that will be obeyed. Number 4. A descendant selector which references a class is more specific than a solitary class selector. So all that means is if we wanted to override this rule, we could say within the footer element, find elements that have a class of highlight. Give them a color of blue. So if we save and refresh, we can see that that paragraph is now blue. And finally, number 5, when two rules have identical specificity values, whichever one comes last in the style sheet will be followed. So let me show you a really quick example. P, color blue, P, color red. So obviously these two have the same specificity values. If we save and refresh, we can see that red is taking precedence, but if we moved blue to sit below this rule, then obviously it takes precedence. Now the reason I bring this up is because the ordering of your style sheet most definitely matters. We will learn in later lessons that it's considered best practice to start with your more generic rules, and then as you work your way down your style sheet, include more and more specific rules. That's going to conclude this lesson. We've learned quite a bit, so let's review. We learned why the word cascading is used to describe style sheets. We learned about inheritance, and we learned about specificity. Now this is the most technical CSS lesson in the course. These are the basic principles that allow us to stay organized in our style sheets. So if everything in this lesson wasn't crystal clear, that's okay. These are concepts that we're going to be relearning and revisiting throughout the course. The main point is that I want you to be familiar with the terms inheritance and specificity. Your understanding of those will continue to grow. So I'll see you in the next lesson.